The Insights Idaho Department of Finance communicates department news and perspectives to aid consumers in making educated financial decisions and to inform both industry and consumers of regulatory and consumer protection issues.
Hello, welcome to the 5th episode of Insights. I'm Celia Kenny, Consumer Affairs Officer with the Idaho Department of Finance. Today I'm joined by Consumer Finance Bureau Chief Erin van Engelen and Deputy Director Anthony Polidori, who will be sharing some basic financial practices that young adults and those who support them can begin implementing to ease the transition to financial independence. Erin is an Idaho native and a graduate of Boise State University. She has been with the department for 18 years and has taught financial literacy at Smart Women, Smart Money Conference, in orientation classes at Boise State, and in various community settings. Erin believes a solid financial education should begin in high school to help our youth navigate the waters of financial independence. Anthony was also born and raised in Idaho. He has been with the department for over 22 years, serving most recently as Deputy Director. Prior to joining the department, Anthony served in the Army and was also a mortgage professional and securities registered representative. Anthony frequently provides training and presentations to industry and consumer groups on topics related to residential mortgage lending, consumer finance, debt collection, and other credit services. With that, I'll transition to you, Erin. I've attended financial literacy presentations of yours in the past and notice how you connect with your audience by sharing your story, specifically the financial lessons you may have learned the hard way as a young adult. Do you mind sharing some of this with our listeners?
Of course. I grew up in a rural town in Idaho, and the only substantial financial education I received was a short section of my economics class that taught us how to balance a checkbook. So very minimal. There was no information about the use of credit or how it could affect you. And when I got into college, credit card companies at that time could still set up booths during orientation week and offer swag if you signed up for their service. Side note, they can't do that anymore. So I signed up not thinking of the consequences, and then I used the cards to pay for items I did not have the cash for, which put me in too much debt at an early age. Unfortunately, I was not the only person in this position. Several of my peers had the same lack of education that led to bad financial habits. Eventually, I learned from my mistakes and I got all my debts paid off, but that was not an easy process. Anthony, what was your experience as a financial freshman, and what tool would have been the most helpful to you as you became responsible for your finances as a young adult?
Thanks, Erin. Well, actually, interestingly enough, I remember my economics class. I did really well in it, but they didn't teach us how to actually balance a checkbook in that particular class. So my first experience with balancing a checkbook was when I was in the Army with a lot of extra disposable income and no actual knowledge on what to do with my accounts as far as balancing checkbooks, knowing how much I've spent on what. And when you're in the Army and you make a mistake on your checkbook and you bounce a check, it can actually lead to significant problems. You can actually be court-martialed for something like that. So I had to navigate some pretty fine lines at that time until I learned myself actually how to balance my checkbook, reconcile my checkbook, and then actually how to start using credit, because my first experience with credit was in the Army as well. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of disposable income. You think you can buy anything. Well, surprisingly, that car that I bought in the Army was not something that I probably could have afforded outside of the Army. And I found that out pretty quickly once I got out of the Army. So planning for my future and planning for how I spent my money was the big lesson that I learned in the military and then once I came out. Now, outside of your own personal experiences, Erin, I know that you manage our Consumer Finance Bureau. And so you deal with consumer services all the time and consumers who use those services. What type of steps would you suggest for young adults to take to begin laying out their personal financial foundation?
First, I think an individual needs to understand how to keep track of their money and how to proactively create a plan for the money coming in and going out, and just practice basic budgeting skills. It's essential to starting out on the right foot. So I would tell them to begin by identifying their short, mid, and long-term financial goals. What do I need or want now, a year from now, or 5 to 10 years from now? And it may seem extreme for some young adults, but what do I want my life to look like when I retire? So if you think about those personal income and savings and how they can be used to support your future, fund those things you want to aspire to, like paying for college, saving for a vacation, buying a home or a vehicle, or perhaps even repaying your student loans. So each of these goals is going to take a different path and amount of time to prepare for. So it's important to track your income and your expenses. Start by writing down a detailed inventory of all purchases and expenditures for the last 3 to 6 months. Review your checking and savings and credit card statements, add up your monthly expenses, divide expenditures by your net income. That's your debt to income ratio for your budget. If your income is greater than your expenses, you're in good shape with a net positive. Time to put money in savings for your goals and consider that net positive can contribute to your financial goals. If your monthly expenses exceed your income, don't panic, but do take it seriously. It's time to look closely for opportunities to cut spending. Just ask yourself if the items you're paying for are necessities or just things you want.
Well, I think those are some great suggestions overall, Erin. Now, you mentioned budgeting and planning for your expenditures. And I said, earlier, it was budgeting myself that caused problems. I didn't budget. I didn't know how to budget. What's interesting is I looked up some polls on this, some studies, and I found that less than half of Americans actually provide or create a budget, maintain a budget for themselves on a monthly basis. And only 33% of all households carry credit over month. And so it's very interesting that if you aren't planning, you aren't budgeting correctly, it can lead to carrying credit that you don't need, credit that's over the cost of which is such that it's not helpful to you. It's a burden to you. It costs you more money than what the actual things are that you're buying. So I'm curious, what type of resources would you suggest that we use to help us learn how to budget better and use credit better?
I think there's plenty of venues. The department has educational information we can provide to consumers that help create budget plans. We do that at the conferences that we attend. We take those materials there with us. They are free to our consumers. There's also budgeting applications and websites that are available, but you really want to be careful when you're looking at those and review the terms of use because some of those entities will charge you for the service. When you're not wanting to create a budget, the last thing you want to do is have some unnecessary spending. So, Anthony, I'm curious, when you look back, is there a particular practice or a habit that you regret not beginning earlier?
Absolutely. Savings. Saving money is the one thing I should have started way earlier. You started working, when you're 15 years old and you spend that money quickly, you didn't save it. Well, I didn't save it. So as I mentioned, by the time I get into the Army and I got disposable income, I'm spending it and not saving it. So I really do think that learning how to save money is the most important that I could have walked away from the Army with as far as a lesson goes, in fact did. And I think it was one of the things that helped me change my overall lifestyle and how I manage my own finances. Now, one of the things I would suggest as far as savings go is how much do you save? Studies show that, since the 1960s to the 80s, the U.S. population saved over 10% of their income, between 10 and 15%. And so 10% always was a good number for me as far as how much I should save, pay myself back first, 10%. But since the 1980s, I've noticed that, American savings has gone down quite a bit. It's usually ranging between 3 to 5% overall. And so I think it's important that we do pay attention to how much that we save. So it's never early or never too early to start saving money and planning for those expenditures that you have. So the way to do that, though, is not just put money in a mattress, obviously. It's to open a checking account, opening a savings account. If you've not done this already, opening an account with a trusted financial institution is a key to successfully managing your personal finances. It's a central place to track your income and your expenses, accumulate your savings, and pay your bills. There's so much to be said for building your personal relationship and account history with the financial institutions, because the better relationship you have with the financial institutions you deal with, potentially the better products and services you might actually obtain from them, such as lower interest rates on some of the lines of credit you might get from the financial institution, getting your car or home loan through them. So when you decide where to open an account, it's always best to look for a combination of great costs, convenience, service, and those you feel you can work with, and they're in your community. Now, the other thing I mentioned too was pay yourself first. As I said, 10% is a good number for me, but how you do it is you should be doing it automatically. And that means mainly ensuring that whenever you have a direct deposit going into your account or whenever you cash a check, some portion of that is going over into your savings for let's say your big ticket items that you want to purchase, or even the small ticket items or the short-term spending that you want to actually engage in. So you don't have to use credit when you actually do those.
You bring up an interesting point, and I know that people are able to put a certain portion away, and you recommend 10%, which I think is a great amount. But what if you don't have the 10% to put away?
Well, a lot of people might be to that point where they don't. I know I was when I was in the Army, again, disposable income, but I had a lot of bills. I ended up having a lot more bills than I thought I did. What I had to do was create discretionary income for myself to save. And I think you may have mentioned this earlier, but it's planning on what you're spending your money on, ensuring that you're paying off those things that you can pay off immediately, and always finding a way to at least leave some back for yourself so that you are putting something away. Yeah, you can't get to 10% now. It's fine if you start with 3% of your savings. It's fine if you start putting your money into a 401k or other employer-sponsored retirement plan. Those types of things are going to help you build a bulk of savings over time that's going to help you with your financial future.
Yeah, the 401k, that was my biggest downfall and something I wish I had really done sooner. I worked for an investment firm in my 20s, and the brokers that I worked for were constantly hounding me to invest in my 401k. But I felt like I needed that income in every paycheck that I could get. And so they even went as far as leaving the 401k application on my desk every morning. Finally, I was convinced to just do 3% of my income into my 401k. I didn't even really notice the difference in my paycheck. And today I'm in a stable place to retire without worry. No, don't worry, I'm not doing that soon.
You better not, Erin. We can't afford to have you retire anytime soon. You make a great point. Start contributing now as soon as you can to a 401k or any other retirement plan. The benefit is that once you start putting that money in, that money, depending on how you have it set up, depending on what you're doing with your money market account, if you have one, or your mutual fund accounts, or how you're reinvesting, overall, your savings will compound in different ways. Now, you can just get a regular savings account that just compounds interest, or you can find other forms of doing that. But the whole point is if you start now early, you start gaining the benefit of the compounding interest or the creation of wealth within your accounts, because that savings will continue to grow upon itself. Your money will earn more money. Now, there are certain times when savings is just not sufficient to cover any expense, that you might have, whether it's funding a college education, a car, weekend getaway. We talk about savings, but, oftentimes you're making those types of big purchases on credit. So, Erin, what are some precautions that people can take to avoid falling into, let's say, a financial pitfall when it comes to using loans and credit?
Anytime money is borrowed to cover a purchase, whether it's the credit card, loan, or buy now, pay later option, credit is being used, and it's important to understand how it functions. Have a solid understanding of the credit or the loan you're considering taking out, as well as a strategy for repayment. That was something I didn't do in my youth very well. So, when considering loan, it's important to know how much you can borrow, how much it will cost, when it will be repaid, and what will happen if you cannot pay it on time. Pay close attention to the terms of any loan or credit card agreement once you've signed or agreed to the conditions. And always make sure you're not spending outside of your limits. If you're considering student loans to fund a college education, it's worth your time to explore all the alternatives and spend the time necessary to research the options. There are grants and scholarships available through so many venues. I wish I had known that, as student loans were a very large portion of my debt. If you're not a stellar student, know that not all scholarship and grant opportunities are based upon academic achievement. You have to learn to recognize detrimental spending habits like overspending so you can course correct that behavior as soon as possible. It goes back to spending on what you need versus what you want. Making only those minimum payments and skipping payments and reaching the limit of available credit can signal a big problem. Best practice really is to pay off the balance of the credit card each month. Some cards offer benefits that you may wish to take advantage of. Personally, I use one that provides me with travel points, but I pay off the balance each month, which helps me also build a healthy credit profile. Considering that we both had a bit of a rocky start as young adults and a little financial education, what happens if a bill is overlooked or an account is sent to collections?
I think that's a great question, Erin. Whether an account has gone into collections because the original bill was overlooked or payments were legitimately late because of unforeseen financial circumstances, I think we all may have been there at some point in time. There are a few crucial steps that you should take as quickly as possible to minimize any negative credit impact that can have. First of all, confirm that a third-party debt collector that might be contacting you, whether it's by phone, mail, email, or any other means of communication, is licensed to do so. Engaging with an unlicensed collector can leave you vulnerable to falling victim to a scam or paying for a debt that's invalid, such as, let's say, a phantom debt, or even a duplicate account, something you've already paid off in the past. Consumers can visit our website at finance.idaho.gov and use our licensee search, or call us at 208-332-8000 to confirm whether or not a collector is licensed. Now, there are some collectors out there who may not be licensed because they're exempt from licensure. It's still important to call us and find out whether or not they're authorized to do the business in Idaho if they're trying to collect a debt. Now, next, let's assume that the collector is licensed with us, and can engage in activities here in the state of Idaho. If that's the case, review your records to determine if you recognize this particular debt. If you do not recognize it, you can advise the collector that you'll be requesting a debt validation. Now, requesting debt validation documentation is essentially a written request that you make to the collector for additional information about the account that's in question. When mailing a written request, consider sending it via certified mail with tracking so that you can make certain that the collector actually received it, and the collector is then required to respond within a certain number of days. Now, if the debt validation documents reveal that the account is unauthorized, it may be a result of identity theft. It could be a result of incorrect reporting on a debt. It may be that the debt was resold to a collector after having been paid off to another collector. So if that's the case, contact the collector, share that information with them, and consider even filing a police report if you think there's been identity theft. And then also you can visit www.identitytheft.gov for suggested resources, including even a personalized recovery plan.
And that is great information. We actually had a consumer call yesterday with the exact same scenario where a company was calling her trying to get her to pay a debt. And it was a debt she had already paid. She contacted the original agency that she paid to get a payoff statement. We think potentially the company that was calling her yesterday was a phantom debt collector. And so that's, perfect way to handle that. So what do you recommend if a person runs into another problem? Let's say they were promised an interest rate on a loan and received another, or were not provided enough information to understand the terms of the loan they entered into.
Well, it's always important to understand the terms of the loan. Right off the bat, if you're a consumer, you have certain rights and protections under state and federal law related to any contract that you're entering into. For example, you're protected against excessive charges and deceptive practices when you engage in getting a loan or attempt to get credit. Other credit protection laws reduce your liability for circumstances that are beyond your control, such as lost or stolen credit cards, unauthorized purchases, or even billing errors. Now, some general protections include the requirement for creditors to provide written notices within 45 days before an interest rate increase on your line of credit or other significant changes to the terms of your credit. And they must inform consumers of their rights to cancel the account prior to any of those changes going into effect. There are other consumer protections in place that businesses and other entities who report to credit, also known as credit furnishers, must follow. But let's just back up a bit. A credit report is a collection of information about an individual and their credit activity. It includes loan payment history and the status of any active accounts that you may have. Your credit will likely be a factor when making important purchases such as a car or home, and can be considered by potential employers or even landlords. Changes to your credit report, such as account balance changes, your monthly payments, the age of an account, they're all required to be reported by these credit furnishers, and they must be reported accurately and timely. And you can and you should dispute any incorrect information that appears on your credit report with a reporting agency such as Equifax, Experian, or TransUnion. Now, to build better credit and to get into good habits of making your credit work for you, the first thing you need to make certain you do is make your monthly payments on time. Then minimize your use of your available credit. Really avoid maxing out your credit cards, especially your revolving debt. So make certain that your revolving debts are low and you keep a healthy debt to credit ratio when using your credit. As I just mentioned, regularly review your credit reports for discrepancies and unrecognized activities. And you can do that free without having to pay any money for credit report numbers or your FICO score or anything else by visiting annualcreditreport.com. You can get information there about how to obtain your free copy of your credit report from each one of the credit furnishers or credit reporting company agencies. And many of the problems that consumers come to us with at the Department of Finance may have been avoided if they had identified an error on their credit report by visiting annualcreditreport.com and getting a free credit report. Now, Erin, there are some final points that I think you would like to cover.
I think one, I want to just make a comment for getting your credit report annually. It's very important to do that. But also, I think there's a lot of financial institutions. You talked about establishing those relationships earlier. There's a lot of financial institutions that will offer you free credit monitoring as well. And so that helps you kind of maintain that eye on your credit report, see if there's anything that's changed significantly for you. And the final tip I'll leave our listeners with is to keep your personal and financial information private. We are all aware of cybersecurity risks and potential hacks to financial institutions. Now, while there are safeguards in place, it doesn't mean that the risks shouldn't be considered. Avoid sharing or personal or financial information such as your driver's license number, social security number, credit card, checking account numbers, login credentials, all of that private information. Monitor your account activity regularly to catch and report any potential mistakes like duplicate charges or unauthorized purchases. Just like your credit report, your checking account, your savings account, your credit card needs to be kind of monitored. This saved me when my debit card was hacked and used in Bahrain for charges of $1,600. I had set up alerts with my financial institution to notify me if there was strange activity that had taken place. I was notified immediately. I was able to contact them, avoid a potential overdraft of my checking account, and get those charges disputed and reimbursed. Other best practices: use safeguards like dual factor authentication, regularly update your passwords, and always, always, always keep your information private. I think that about covers it.
Well, thank you so much, Erin and Anthony, for your time today and for sharing these great tips for those taking their first steps on their own financial journey. Even for those of us who have been managing our personal finances for years, this has been a great refresher. Thank you also to our listeners for joining us on this 5th episode of Insights. Be sure to continue to listen throughout April as we celebrate Financial Literacy Month, releasing a new podcast episode each week. We'll continue to share valuable information and feature guest speakers you will not want to miss.
We want to thank you for joining us for our production of Insights, the Idaho Department of Finance. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about the ideas and topics that are on your mind. Forward your suggestions and feedback to our email address, finance@finance.idaho.gov.